Yeah, no, yes, it's absolutely horrific, and it seems to be. I mean, you're talking about this piecemeal, giving a little bit and then taking it back. I mean, you mentioned, I think, before when we spoke earlier, that they're using it as a bargaining chip, if you like, with people outside Afghanistan, with the governments outside Afghanistan, to sort of say, well, if you recognize us as the official government of Afghanistan, then maybe we might do something more for the women. It's almost like it's very manipulative. It's horrific because the effect is immediately on the women. And it seems so offensive, this idea of recognizing such a misogynistic regime. I mean, what are your thoughts about that? I mean, do we have to recognize them to allow women to have, and is that a guarantee that women will have more rights if they are recognized?
Yeah. Well, and the tricky part is that I don't think they're playing it as a very explicit give and take here, where if you do this, then we're going to do this. But it's almost like understood that these are the things that they want, because they've been asking for those things, but not asking it for it at the same time that they're doing, they're issuing the edicts, or talking about the rollback on women's rights.
Mm,
Whether or not I believe they should be recognized, I don't want them to be recognized, because it on principle feels wrong, feels morally
yes.
wrong to recognize a regime that would be this incredibly misogynistic. To recognize a regime that doesn't recognize half of its population does not make any sense to me, right?
Mm,
Now that being said, that's my opinion. I think really what we should be looking at is, what do the people of Afghanistan want to say about this? What do the women Afghan, how do they feel about this? How do they feel about their government being recognized potentially, when they're suffering and when their rights have been pulled back so much? So, and really what we're hearing is the women in Afghanistan continue to protest. So even a few days ago, I was seeing women taking to the streets in protest. So they're not happy with their situation, and they have had a very similar cry to the Iranian women's cry and the Iranian people's cry, which has been woman, life, freedom. The Afghan women who had been protesting from even last year had been calling for work, bread, and life.
mm,
And so, and freedom. And these are the very, very similar calls for just honestly the basic staples of existence.
mm.
So these women are standing up. Are we seeing millions of people come to the streets? Not really. Number one, Afghanistan is amidst a very acute and deep humanitarian crisis, and so you have almost the entire population living in poverty right now. You've also had a serious crackdown on these protests and demonstrations by the Taliban. So many people who have stood up and protested have been arrested, detained, interrogated. For example, there is from Penn Foundation, or from Penn, one of the individuals, Mathieu Wissaw, he has been delivering school books around the country to children, and he is now detained by the Taliban. And
Mm.
this is a person who literally his life's passion is to share books with children. If you look at his Twitter, that's what he's been doing. And so he's been detained. There's really no explanation for why, but you know that it's because these are the types of things they can't tolerate. So the voices of the Afghan people, I think, are pretty clear that they're not happy with this regime, and the women in particular.
Mm.
So
Oh,
recognition really is a troubling decision.
yes.
Sometimes you hear some rumblings about it internationally. There's official recognition, and then there's sort of the unofficial recognition, right? You have some countries who have been, even since last year, engaging with the Taliban because of interest in financial and trade agreements. Like, China, you've had Pakistan having relationships with them. Russia's had talks with them. I mean, I think China has essentially rolled out like a red carpet for them as well. And then even in the Middle East, they've still had some, relationships there. So I mean, I think that's one place to take a look at and say, well, what are
Yeah.
these
Mm,
economic arrangements happening? What are these trade arrangements happening?
mm,
And where is the leverage? Is anyone willing to put some leverage, use that financial leverage
mm.
to stand up for Afghan women? And then, of course, there's the question of official international recognition. And the issue there is some people are feeling like, well, if we don't officially recognize them, then we can't really engage in conversations with them, and we can't push them. Um, which is not necessarily true. And one thing is that they have been having the luxury of kind of moving around and flying to different locations to meet people and meet different countries. We're all sitting here on Zoom because we can't necessarily do that. So it is possible to have conversations, to engage in dialogue without rolling out the red carpet for a group that it's truly a terrorist regime that has come into power.
Yes. Yeah, indeed. I mean, this question of the funding of the Taliban at the moment, I mean, obviously, a lot of the funding was cut after the Taliban moved in, and that was from the West. But we understand that there's constant funding going in there from, for example, the Middle East. And I mean, is action currently being taken in the United States, where you or interfere or somehow influence that, to prevent the funding of the Taliban? And, I mean, what can we do in terms of persuading our own governments to, what can we do?
And so this is where it gets really, really tough. People have had to make some nuanced analyses of the situation because the United States continues to send. I mean, I think the United States sends funds by way of the United Nations, right? So there is international humanitarian funds that go to Afghanistan. The question was always like, how can we do that without the money going into the pockets of the Taliban, without it going to the Taliban government?
Mm.
And so the community has really tried to just direct the funds towards development organizations and nonprofits that are actually doing the work right on the ground, which is tricky. Everything always gets tricky because it's one thing to say that, and logistically, it's quite another to say, well, who are you actually sending the money to, and how are you routing it, and how are you making sure that the Taliban don't get a cut of it? But to be honest, the Taliban were getting a cut of the money that was going into Afghanistan, at least from the U.S. side, in the past 20 years as well. I mean, if you read any of the journalistic works that are out there about the United States' military mission in Afghanistan, a lot of the money, the investments that went in that were supposed to go to projects, for example, if they had a development project in one part of the country, part of that would include paying off Taliban so that they could, cross a certain road and get to that area and develop it. So it is a complex and very messy situation. But that being said, I think that's the push, is really to look for ways, nuanced ways, to direct funds towards the people, towards these humanitarian dire causes, without directly funding the Taliban. But I agree with you that taking a look at their funding is really critical because it can uncover, really what their alliances are. And of course, one of the cries of the Taliban was that they were going to get rid of all the corruption and the vices in Afghanistan, including drugs. And yet the drug trade seems to be financing them pretty well.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, what can we do ourselves? I mean, what, we pressure our politicians? What do we do? How do we? Because obviously, I mean, it would be delightful to see the Taliban gone. And that's not going to happen anytime soon, because I think everyone has exhausted the idea of, military interference in Afghanistan. That's a dead issue now. No one's going to even try that probably for a very, very long time. So how to remove the Taliban? I mean, obviously cut the funding, but how can we as concerned individuals, act and influence that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think this is not where we're crying out for a military intervention again. I mean, I think that what the world has seen is enough bloodshed on Afghan soil.
Mm.
So from here on out, it is a long game. And I think those of us who are involved at the advocacy level, and even in conversations that we've had with, United States State Department, this is going to be a long game where it's really trying to finesse the situation with this current regime, because it doesn't look like that they're going anywhere anytime soon.
Indeed.
So what can we do? I mean, I think is to follow the push of the Afghan population, and particularly those who are most vocal, often are the diaspora, those who have freshly left Afghanistan, who've been forced out of the country. And for example, one organization to follow is called Together Stronger. And this is not an official organization. It's not a 501c3. It is sort of this loose collective of Afghans, mostly women, but women who were and are working in all different sectors, but very much active individuals who had served in Afghan government, who'd served in human rights in Afghanistan, human rights defending, civil society building, all types of fields around the world now, and coming together to actually put together some thoughts. And so that's one good place to follow to understand how to align oneself with Afghan women and with their authentic priorities, and not the priorities that others or Westerners or anybody else
Yeah.
would want for them, but rather, what they're looking at themselves. Because
Yeah.
the issue with Afghanistan has always been that it's a land of nuance. And I think that's when we talk about, failed strategies in Afghanistan, that's been one of the culprits. And so listening to those who understand those nuances, who have worked and lived and breathed those nuances, is really key to having any types of successful interventions at this point.
That sounds fantastic. So Together Stronger is that what's the address, the website address? Simply Together
So they're
Stronger.
on Twitter. I think it's just
All
at
right.
Together Stronger. Which I can share with Shikha. She's probably looking for it right now because I see her.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm putting
Okay.
it on the chat.
Yeah.
And they recently put out a letter as well, where they kind of issued some really clear directives and where their stances are.
Marvelous. That's fantastic. Look, can I just go to the particular, because I think, I mean, a lot of what I've been reading in your books that has really astounded me. I was hoping you could maybe mention it to our audience. It will also, I hope, encourage you to read Nadia's books, because they're just absolutely fascinating. But this concept of the little girls that disguise themselves as boys so that they can actually go outside their house and help their family. If the family has no boy who's old enough to, for example, do the food shopping, this is the Baka Posh, I think it is. Is that still going on? And it's extraordinary. Tell us a bit more about that.
So the Bachaposh tradition is one that not every Afghan family engages in this practice, but enough that, like, I can say that if I speak to anyone who was born and raised in Afghanistan or lived there for a time, they may know of one. So it's sort of that degree, or have heard of one. And so the way the practice works is that for families who don't have a son, one of the ways that superstitiously they may believe that they could actually bring a son into the family is to dress one of their girls as a boy for a time. And 50-50 chance of that working out when the next child is born, for them to validate that belief. The other reason that some families engage in this practice is for the logistics of it. That having a young boy is a lot easier than sending a daughter out into the market, or just to work and do different things, and work as a breadwinner. And so the families may choose to take a child, and it's usually a younger child, and they just physically transform the child by cutting hair, changing the clothing, and assigning a boy's name, and that's it. And so a lot of people in the family will, of course, they'll know that this is a actual female child, but is dressing as a boy. People in the community may know, but they may not know if they haven't really, known what's going on in the family's household, or what age the child is. And then that's it. And then it's rather transient, because before the child becomes of pubertal age, it's usually undone, because once a girl is reaching puberty, then things are harder to hide, and then they really kind of bring back to the traditional roles. But what happens to the child during that time is rather interesting, because for some of these individuals, they take on the characteristics of a boy in a patriarchal society, which means that all of a sudden there's this different level of self-confidence and an understanding of what can happen out there in the world, and what they can do in the world, and that right to navigate the society a bit more freely. And so that's just anecdotally looking, because we don't have any data that really tracks any of this in a more organized way, or studies it in a more organized way. But it really does demonstrate that when you look at individual stories, that there's something internally that kind of changes fundamentally, and that actually can have a lasting effect. And so you'll hear of, there's like an Afghan female parliamentarian who was a Bachaposh when she was younger. Would she have still been a parliamentarian There are other parliamentarians who weren't dressed as a boy when they were younger, but her path and being one of the most vocal parliamentarians, maybe living as a boy for a time had something to do with it.
And presumably now that women's freedom of movement has been so drastically cut now by the Taliban, that is particularly in, for example, in a family of a widow of girls, a family of girls, that is their only lifeline really to getting food into the house. Would that be right?
It is. Yeah, and people used to ask me, when do you think this tradition will go away?
Mm,
And I used to say, well, it's an economic tool as well, right? So
mm,
it's one that enables some households to be a little bit more secure financially. So when the fundamental economic value of a girl
yeah.
changes,
Mm,
then this practice will be outdated and useless. And that we were on track for that. So Afghanistan was on track for
yeah.
that because you
Mm,
had so many more girls going to school. You had so
mm,
many women working. You had women entrepreneurs. You had women in all sectors.
mm,
And it would become less and less interesting for a family to transform one of their girls into a boy's if they had continued on that trajectory.
mm,
But now we're back to where it is again a very different situation.
mm. And then also the horrific child marriages that I assume are on the increase now under the Taliban because of
Yeah,
the
and
limited
again, these are
options now
things
for
that
women.
we don't have numbers for it. We can't
Mm,
really track it.
mm,
But I think globally, those who are working on the ground understand that
mm,
that's the risk. So when you combine, right, a
mm,
family that is again now thrown into poverty, a lot of jobs have gone, inflation was on the rise after August of 2021. And
mm,
so financially, a lot of families are in crisis and they've got these children. They don't really have necessarily great access to healthcare.
mm,
Schooling is out for the girls. What are these families supposed to do? And they make really, choices that we wouldn't want families to make, but it's
mm,
created some really ugly situations.
mm,
And I remember even from last August, in the fall, we had a lot of individuals who had fled Afghanistan during that massive evacuation. In the course of that evacuation and people coming to the United States, for example, I had worked with families with individuals on a mental health program for these evacuees and got
mm,
to meet many people. I met three sisters who, told me their story where they had one was in medical school, one had just gotten accepted to medical school, another was in college, and they fled because their parents told them run when they saw that the Taliban
mhm,
had come to take their more remote area. These sisters had fled to Kabul, thinking Kabul would be safe.
mm,
And then, of course, when Kabul fell, they were, one of those who had run to the airport and come. And I asked them, what made your parents tell you to run? I mean, what a dramatic and difficult decision that must have been for their parents as well. And these sisters told me that they were worried that we would have to be married off if the Taliban came in, because
mm,
in some cases that's what the demands were, was that they were coming in and wanting to get married. Same thing for even my husband's cousin, who was widowed in Afghanistan. Her ex-husband, or not her husband's family had rather turned towards the Taliban, and
mm,
they were telling her that they were going to come back for her children, who were now, her daughter was grown, and make some decisions for her daughter as well. And so she had to go into hiding for a bit. So the dynamics on the ground for families really changed, and that has a very direct impact on girls and what potentials they have for their life. If there are no jobs out there for women, it's much more reasonable for a family to say, well, then she can get married. And what's the difference between 18 and 17? And then slowly there's a slide that you can
yes.
see there.
Yes. Yeah. Look, speaking of your cousin's wife, who's now a widow, is it true that widows are regarded as immoral people because there's no man now in their house? Is that true? And I mean, can you speak specifically to the fate of widows at the moment, particularly widows with families to feed? How are they coping?
So I wouldn't say that widows are seen as immoral. I think they're in a precarious position because Afghanistan is so honor bound, right? And so
Yeah. Mm,
part of the honor of a widow is in this almost like persistent grieving state for a husband who's been lost, right? So the idea of remarriage in Afghanistan for a widow, it's a decision that would be made for a widow and not by the widow herself. And so sometimes, families will do that. Well, let's say, well, she should be married to somebody, and she may get remarried off like to someone else within the family as a way to like save some honor and make sure that there's no allegations that here's an unwed woman and questions about her goings about. Financially also there's an issue there because it's much harder for a widow to support her family. I mean, that's, I think, pretty easy for anyone to understand, is that you go from a two-person household to a one-person household. There's a giant enormous financial strain. And so logistically also there's sort of this, idea that maybe a widow should be rewed. But aside from that, for the number of widows who do not get remarried or married off again, and I think that's a good number, really. I don't know the demographics for what happens to widows in Afghanistan, but I know the different paths that they can take. Those who stay alone are going to have to face the world kind of unguarded, unchaperoned, right? Because it does logistically make life easier if they have a male living in the home to help them make decisions, engage in conversations, whether it's about their rent or about, economics and how are they going to, feed their children or make decisions about their children's, next steps in life. I mean, even the basics of like how to arrange for a marriage, right? So these are things that usually happen as families and as units. For a woman to do it on her own is going to be quite a challenge. But my husband's cousin, for example, had been living all these years as a widow, raising her children. And she actually had been working, not in any governmental position, but as a support person in the presidential palace. And it was fine. It was okay for her. But that was because she had the opportunity to work. Not all Afghan women have the ability to actually get out there. Her children were a bit older, and so she was able to do that to support her family.
I understand that now
That's
under the
going to be
Taliban,
tougher.
they can't work now under the Taliban, women. Is that right?
And so this is where it gets really, really tricky again. So the Taliban issue these edicts. They haven't said globally that women can't work, but they have taken them out of so many different fields, and they've made it so incredibly challenging for women to work. In journalism, for example, they would say, no, the women can't work until we create a more appropriate office setting for them, which doesn't mean
Never
anything
gets created,
whatsoever, right? Like another coffee machine or what? Like, I don't know what that means. But the other sectors, you do have women who are still working in some ways. You do have some women who are still working, for example, in the healthcare field, because they need women to treat women. Now, they're not going to have more women working in the healthcare field because women are not going to school past a certain level of education. So that's going to be a dead end coming up soon. You do have some women who are working as teachers because, again, the way they've structured the education restrictions is that you can't have girls being taught by male teachers. So you have to have women teachers teaching the girls. But again, if you have stymied the flow of professionals getting out there, you're not going to have those people that you need to maintain these real, gender divisions. So you do have women working in Afghanistan. So to some extent, the society is continuing to operate, but in ways that are incredibly adapted. Like, for example, Ashiana is an education center that I support in Kabul. They provide education and nutrition for the children who would be breadwinners on Afghan streets. And so what they have had to do to adapt was that, they used to have sports programs for girls as well. So they did everything for boys and girls. When the Taliban came over again in 2021, they had to adjust. So first what they did was they had to, they met with the Taliban, actually got some permissions to continue operating, and said, okay, fine, we'll take away the girls' sports programs. So that was the one, accommodation that they made. And then they had to do, and then of course they actually ended up closing Ashiana for girls and said they couldn't. Now they've brought the girls back in and gotten permission again. But that's really what you're seeing is there's just sort of, okay, we can do this, but not that anymore. And so there's, a level of function. And there's also a wide variety in how strictly enforced these rules are, depending on the local vibe and the local Taliban government as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, are things worse in the country or are things worse in Kabul? Where is it better to be a woman in Afghanistan today?
It's probably better in the cities because you still have, the cities were always more progressive. You had more women, more girls going to school in the major cities than you did in other areas.
Mm,
So that's probably to some extent still playing out because the local vibe is more progressive in
mm,
some areas. I mean, Kabul was a city where you had all different kinds of restaurants, you had coffee shops, you had, big wedding halls. A lot of businesses had set up shop there. So that's still, those mentalities are still present in the households. And then in the local level, you still have some of that playing out too. But in the countryside, it's harder really to track exactly what's going on.
Um, could I ask, on behalf of, there have been people who've donated money who have asked questions specifically about Aseel, because it's obviously very hard, as you described, it's very hard to get money into Afghanistan without knowing for sure that, for example, the Taliban aren't going to take a slice. Also, obviously, mobility in Afghanistan is now much more limited, particularly for women. How does Aseel operate? And how do we know that these widows are going to get the money we've donated? Can you tell us a bit more about
Aseel
them?
has been, yeah, it's great. Aseel has been a really innovative way, and I think that's why the organization has gotten so much recognition from the international community. It's because they have really innovated in a tight space,
Mm,
in a really, I don't know, a thorny space as well. I have no affiliation with the organization, so I have not been involved with it at any level other than the fundraisers that Shikha has done.
mm,
So I'm speaking as a spectator and just knowing what I know because I've read about them some. But they have combined, their technology with this app and enabled people to kind of give very directly in a way that provides some accountability too, because they're tracking who they're donating to. So they're tracking the recipients on
mm,
the other side. And that's really been a powerful way, I think, of giving people some sense of security that when you're donating, that it's going directly here,
mm.
and that it's going to its intended recipient instead of going sideways somehow. The other thing that I like about Aseel just personally is that they actually support artisans and they support, uh, you know, uh, tradespeople on a very individual way as well. And so Aseel has a website where you can go shopping too. And I've purchased items off of Aseel. They ship very quickly and they're great items.
Mm.
And so that's another way to really support, I think, yeah, a more organic um development of the country is where you support people who are actually engaged in trade, and
Mm.
keeping the crafts and the arts alive is so important as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, thank you for that. Look, I think we've got some fun questions, which I think that Shika is going to ask you, so we can get to know you a little bit more. And then we're going to open up generally for questions. So Shika, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. And of course, thanks to both you and Nadia, as always, for helping all of us make a little difference. So Nadia, these are slightly fun questions. A quick 10. Your favorite genre to read?
Oh, probably historical fiction, but that's so hard.
Your favorite comfort food?
Mm, coffee is coffee.
The next question was tea or coffee, so you answered that. A movie or series you recently watched that you enjoyed?
So I had always sworn that I would wait until I was retired to watch This Is Us. It's a series that's on TV, and I remember when the series was actually on, everybody would be on Facebook, the day after it aired, and be like, "Oh my God, devastated by yesterday," and I was always like, "What is this?" But I've started it, and I am just blown away. It's quite moving. So it is, I try to save it for my quiet time, or when I'm exercising or something, where I get pulled in and sucked into it so much. So this is us.
Nice. The most challenging aspect about being a writer?
Really, if the time, I think for me, it's the time, is making sure to give it the time that it deserves, that it needs, that it demands. I think that's the struggle for all of us, is like, how do we get enough time for the things that we really want to, put our lives into, our hearts into. The rest of it is the fun struggle.
Okay. The thing you most enjoy about being a writer?
Meeting readers. I think meeting readers has always felt like it completes the process, or it gives the stories more purpose. Because I mean, I think about it, if I were to write a story and just have it live on my computer somewhere, that would be okay. I would feel okay that I wrote a story. But the fact that these stories actually make it onto people's shelves, their nightstands, they're with them on a train as they're going somewhere, it propels them to then Google something after they've read the book or halfway through the book, makes them like, I mean, you have connected with so many Afghan people and supported so many Afghan people through your work, and Sarah now as well, and Ritu has. And so this is where I've just been absolutely blown away by the connection with readers, and then sort of what that has been able to do out there in the world.
It's a testament to your writing, Nadia, and to you. I will say that now. It's a new group, so I'm allowed to gush a little bit and not sound too repetitive. Okay. 2 songs we would find on your current playlist.
Oh, okay. I don't have a playlist. The 2 songs, I mean, well, I will say that my Pandora stations, I listen a lot to Coldplay, Adele, and U2.
Nice. Okay. Lazy beach days or long mountain hikes?
Oh, lazy beach days. I'm so sorry.
You actually took a call once, I think, with a whole bunch of readers while you were on holiday at a beachside place. I remember that. And you were taking calls from readers even then. This is going to be a tough one. Nadia the reader or Nadia the writer, who do you most identify with? And I will add that if you can follow Nadia on Goodreads, and I've put that link in the chat, and she is a voracious reader. I think 50 plus books a year, and Goodreads is constantly sending me those numbers, and then I have to look at what I've read. But Nadia the reader or Nadia the writer, who do you most identify with?
I would maybe even say the reader, because I wouldn't be the writer if it hadn't been for the reader. It's the reading that really brought me to books, that really, summoned me to the stacks and the pages, and this love for stories. And so that's truly my foundation, is like the little kid who was reading my way through the library every summer, wanting to read more books than anybody else. The only way that I get to that number now, Shikha, is really because of audiobooks. For a long time, I was first it was no, it's got to be an actual physical book, not these ebooks. I can't read that way. And then I started reading on my phone because I was desperate to. And then I turned away from the audiobooks. I put that off for a while, but it's the best. If I'm walking my dog, if I'm doing things around the house, I've got an audiobook running. And I do play it at a pretty I play it at like 2x speed. My children walk in sometimes and they're like, do you even know what they're saying? And I'm like, yes. If you just don't talk very much, then I'll know what they're saying, right? But the audiobooks have helped me a lot to, when I'm driving or anything. That's been my go-to.
It's nice. 2 things you have, and this is the last question, but 2 things you have on your bucket list that you can share with us.
Oh, that's a good one. Well, we're trying to think of next travel destinations, and I think one for us would be Morocco. That's one. Is to get the kids out there and see the world. We just did a trip to Turkey with our children, and that was incredible. And there's so many Afghans who are visiting Turkey, and I truly believe, and Iranians as well. And I really feel like this is Afghans trying to get to Afghanistan, to get close to Afghanistan without actually going there, to enjoy that freedom of what their homeland might have looked like had it not, you know, dissolved into war and conflict for so many decades. The other item on my bucket list, you know, I don't really have a bucket list, but maybe I should. I mean, I think yeah, I can't even think of something. If I thought of something right now, it wouldn't be genuine. So I'm gonna save it, but I'll work on it.
Maybe an Insta story, and I can share that with everyone. Put it there. We'll actually, Sarah, should we open the floor out to everyone? So
yes, I think that's a very good idea. So yeah.
I will start off with mine. Nadia, not forced, but my 16-year-old, almost 16-year-old has joined the call here. And hopefully she's still on it and doesn't just have a video on. But your first middle grade novel comes out next year. And I would love to know what message you would give to this new generation of girls who are almost out there in the world and will probably face things like misogyny and sexism. Something for the young ones.
Yeah, so for the young ones, I mean, I do this with my daughter as well. So I have two daughters. My older daughter just turned 12, and my younger one is 7, going on 17. She's the biggest and boldest in the family, though. And you know what I tell them is to know their worth, right? Because for them to know their value means that no one else will be able to devalue them, means that they'll know to stand up, they'll know to recognize when someone is awarding them less than they're deserving of. One thing I've been telling my daughter since she was little, and she would get upset with her brother or something would happen, and you know, he did this to me or so and so did this to me, and my refrain for her was always, don't get sad, get mad. Because I think that getting mad is not that I want people to walk around angry, but I wanted her to understand that she should stand up, she should do something about it, say something about it, and take some action rather than just to continue to just feel it in her, because that would make her feel bad. I didn't want her to do that. I wanted her to be the one actually responding, you know. And that's what I hope for young women as well, is to know their worth and then take action based on what their worth is, right? So stand up for yourself, whether it's when you're asking for, you know, a raise at a job that you've been at, you've been performing well, to know that you're getting what you deserve there. Whether it's in a meeting where, you know, maybe you want to make sure that your opinions are heard, and you should speak up because your opinions have value as well. You have a contribution to make, or you know, if you're putting books out there or considering putting books out there, that your stories deserve to be on the shelves just as much as anyone else, that you deserve to serve in government, you deserve to do all of these things, and all of these things are a potential. So that's my words for them.
Thank you so much. Ria, I hope you are listening. If anybody would like to ask their question, you can put it in the chat, but of course we would love for you to ask yourself as well. You can just unmute yourselves, actually.
I think I did see a question coming through from Leanne at one point. Leanne?
I'm going to pick on Ritu Himnani.
It was Damrat, Sarah, in the chat actually, about the Taliban and drugs.
Oh.
Well, if I think Damrat's question, Damrat, correct me if I'm wrong here, but you were indicating that the Afghan gets a lot of their funding from illegal drugs, and this is one of the issues and problems.
The drug money. So it's very hard to, again, track the finances of the Taliban. There's probably someone out there doing some good journalistic work. I mean, I've been on calls with people who had talked about maybe we should do a deeper dive into the finances, but it's a bit elusive to understand exactly how much. And so a lot of what's put together is sort of from understandings on the ground. But again, you know, what happens is that you have to confirm a lot of things in order for it to kind of meet muster and get out there publicly, and for international governments to kind of take it into consideration. And you know, and the victims in Afghanistan don't necessarily have that time and luxury. But the understanding is that there is a good amount of funding that goes to the Taliban because of the continued drug operations in the country.
From a teaching perspective, are there sort of resources out there for talking to, I guess, younger students or kids about these sorts of issues? Or I guess, is there anything you can do to kind of approach this with like younger kids, or do you find that it's a bit difficult because it's quite a heavy topic?
So you like in other countries, for example, you mean with students?
Yeah, so I guess in
think,
terms of what's happening globally, or especially in Afghanistan.
I think there are ways to approach it, to engage in conversations at every level, and just depends on the level of the child, right, of that group. So I mean, for high school students, I think I mean, I've had high school students read my books as well. I think they're very capable of understanding what's happening in Afghanistan, the full picture of it. I mean, I would be comfortable sharing any of this with a high school student. If you get down to like middle grade, those ages, then again, I think this is pretty, I mean, all of this is stuff that we talk about in our household, and my middle graders would understand any of this as well, because it's sort of this, I mean, it's politically complex, but it's very simple in terms of, you know, what's happening to girls and women, and what the intervention did for 20 years and the opportunities that it created. There's also a lot of nuance in there too, right? And that's why the Taliban were able to kind of take hold, is because of the failings of the interventions of the last 20 years as well. And then when you cut down to the younger age, then it becomes a much more simple conversation. So I'm just thinking of my own children and how I would engage. I have a, you know, 8 and a 7-year-old, and for them, it would be more of a conversation of, there's a lot of poverty in Afghanistan. There was war there for a long time. And now there's this regime that's in power that doesn't believe that women should have and girls should have the same rights as boys. And so just a more simplistic version of it. But I think the awareness is not bad. They may not be able to fully comprehend it. And sometimes, you know, they get this, you know, that's horrible, and I'm going to go out there and get them, and why don't you just put them all in jail, and that kind of response. But I think those are the small conversations that introduce something into their minds, plants a little bit of a seed for future conversations where it, you know, it sounds familiar, and now I'm a little bit more interested, and I'm a little bit more able to understand it.
Can I ask a question? Sorry.
Carol.
Are you hearing me?
Yes, Carol, we can.
Okay. Nadia, I don't know your books, and this might be a question better directed at Sarah and Shikha, but if I was to recommend one to an adult, which would, okay, I can't read it, which
I'll put it in the chat. Carol, I'll email you all her books. I'm the wrong person to ask this question because I will say all. But the
yeah, me too. Yeah.
And being mightier than the sword, the more people who know what's actually going on, the better. And I'd also like to ask, is there anything that the Taliban has done which has benefited women?
Oh, so what the Taliban have claimed to have done, and it's hard to get a sense of it, but so there were a lot of issues with the previous Afghan government in terms of, and the 20 years of involvement by the US, because of a lot of, you know, money getting into the country without necessarily the right accountability. And so those are conversations the US is now having to hold itself accountable, to understand, you know, where did we fail in Afghanistan? And what did our spending really do? Because a lot of the money went into the country and then kind of floated right back out. It went into the hands of one contractor and then another. And then there was a lot of allegations of corruption within the Afghan government itself. So one of the things that the Taliban claim to have done is to restore some level of morality within the government so that people don't have to worry about corruption there. So they've been this, this really draconian group, but they've also said that, well, we're going to do it the right way, in this, law and order type of rule. So I'm not sure if that's really playing out though for the Afghan women. That's if it would, and if they could get rid of corruption, then that would be one thing. I think that the end of the involvement of the West meant that you no longer had these like drone attacks, and you no longer had these raids on different villages looking for, members of the Taliban, where a lot of innocent lives were lost. And that's another thing that ate away at the goodwill of the people in Afghanistan too, were the casualties that they had suffered over these years of war. And any type of military involvement is an imperfect one. And so if there's one thing, it's been that the end of conflict and the end of these sort of, raids and attacks means that you probably have fewer civilian deaths. All of that is kind of, you weigh that against, well, you've got more people who are being targeted. I mean, you even have one member of the Taliban recently was on Twitter saying we should go after those who are in exile. Oh. And it seems to be, a call for violence right there on Twitter. So, give and take, but I would say that's probably more a benefit of the end of military engagement rather than as a direct result of the Taliban.
And have the Taliban left the antiquities alone? It's not nothing to do with women, but it is to do with culture and society.
To be honest, I don't know what their take has been on the antiquities. I don't think they're really interested in it very much. So they probably have left it alone just because they wouldn't know what to do with it.
But it was the Taliban who destroyed Bamiyan, was it not?
Yeah, the Bamiyan, yeah. Mm.
It was. And so, but I think that was also incredibly large and visible, and there was some political play there as well. In terms of actually, so the antiquities are part of the story in Sparks Like Stars, very specifically, and what happened to them in conflict. Right now, I don't know what their interest is with the antiquities or what they've been doing with it. To be honest, the conversations have, again, the antiquities are sort of a luxury item when you're in a humanitarian crisis. And so the conversations that I'm seeing are not around that specifically. It doesn't really make them less important. They really are. But less talked about. So I'm not sure.
Thank you.
I do have a question, but before I ask it, I just wanted to say a great thank you to Sarah and Shikha just for giving us this opportunity, just for having our minds opened and our hearts tugged. And I think that's something that we can continue to keep on doing so that we don't forget how important this plight is and how it continues, how they go day after day, waiting and hoping for someone to step in and make a difference, because that's what they need. I would like to just say I appreciate you so much, Nadia, as a reader, as a writer, as an activist, because it's so inspiring to read through your stories, through the worlds you build, through knowing how real they are, through seeing the suffering firsthand, and then to watch you roll your own sleeves up and get your hands dirty and actually be on the ground working with staff and knowing so much yourself and sacrificing so much of your time. It's very touching. And I know that apart from giving directly to the charities and spreading awareness, I think one of the best things we can do are read your books and spread awareness of your books and share your books. So I'd like to know a little bit more about the books that you're working on currently and in the near future. And I'd like to know if you would ever think of writing a book of an ideal Afghanistan, where one day the value of women is realized in the best possible way.
I appreciate all of that, Ritu. There was a lot in there, so thank you. And it is good to see you again. I think so. When well, let me start with what I'm working on right now. I'm finishing up the last round of what I hope are the last round of revisions. I'm going back and forth with my editor on what will be my first young adult book. So I've done middle grade, and then this will be a real young adult book that deals more with the an Afghan-American family in the background, there's this influx of Afghan refugees and a town that's sort of, grappling with its feelings around refugees coming into town. And then this family sort of dealing with, young people and identity and how much to stand up and how much to voice their opinions. What I write about in Ideal Afghanistan, I think my dad said one time, because they left before the conflict started in Afghanistan. And one day recently he was saying, I feel like I'm so lucky because I lived through the best of it. And he never saw his homeland actually in war. When he left in the early part of the 70s, there were some rumblings. So the Cold War tensions were on the ground. They were playing out at the college level. There were protests because there was a socialist movement. There was the other movement. And so his classes were canceled half the time. And that's why he decided to take off and go to New York to see what else he could do. But he actually lived through in Afghanistan, and my mom did as well. That was nurturing, that was peaceful, that was like making its way into the world. And so, they would see the president of Afghanistan. They've seen different periods of time where things were possible, things were happening. My mom went to school, she became a civil engineer, her sisters went to college, women were doing things. The pictures from that era show women dressing the way they want to dress. There was a lot of music that was happening at that time, cultural festivals and different celebrations that were happy. And if I wanted to capture anything, it was a perfect world, but it was on its way. And I think that's probably as close to perfect as we can get, is where things are moving in a much better direction towards equality, right? That's as close to perfect as I think we can get. And that's what I wrote about in Sparks Like Stars, very specifically because I wanted to capture it, because I wanted people to know what had existed.
Yeah.
And the fact that it existed before makes people even more desperate to see it exist again. They were getting closer to it in the last 20 years. Again, not perfect, but working their way towards a society that was more equal and nurturing for everybody. I'm hopeful that it will come again, as Afghanistan seems to go through incredibly tumultuous cycles, but we'll see how far off in the distance it is.
I mean, on that note, Nadia, what would you predict for Afghanistan in, say, 5 years' time, 10 years' time? I mean,
it's a really tough one. As the writer in me wants to craft a happy ending here. I'm not really sure what's possible. I think there's going to be a continued struggle within the country where you have people pushing. You can't really manage a humanitarian crisis for a very long time. At some point, you have to make some accommodations. So you also see some rumblings of dissent within the Taliban itself. I mean, some of the members of the Taliban leadership send their own children to school outside the country, the daughters to school outside the country, right?
right.
So at some point, this system is not going to work. You're not going to have trained the next generation of teachers. You're not going to have trained the next generation of women that you need to serve, even in those roles where they deliver services only to girls and women. So I think that by necessity, there's going to be some shift in this regime. I don't know if there's going to be a big turnover in the regime itself. And so we may just have this really long, slow crawl. And that's why efforts like this one make such an impact, because there is no major, the light switch that's going to turn on in the country in the next year or 2 years or anything like that. And so, but the sustenance that's provided makes a dramatic difference in the day of each of these families that are being helped.
Sarah, I'd just like to quickly come in and say, sorry, I keep forgetting to do that.
Where are you?
Raised a little over 3,600 USD.
Good.
Anybody who would like to donate more, spread the word. We really want to reach more families. And with this, we'll be able to support 42 families as per Aseel, and with food supplies to last a family of 4 for a little over 2 months. So we want to take this number up higher. So,
yes,
whoever you can share this with, please.
I think we said on that campaign we wanted 5,000. If we could get to that, that would be
Yes,
fantastic.
I dared to hope that
Yeah.
number with the last fundraiser. I have put it out there with this
Yeah.
fundraiser, and hopefully I can manifest it again. So,
But I think also for everyone listening, that the it's going to remain online, and I mean you can donate right up, I think, to the end of May. And if
yes.
you've got friends that you think would be interested to hear this session, it's been recorded, so any donation will then entitle someone to basically see the video link and learn more. You know, so if you've got, you know, book clubs, or you're part of Rotary, or I know we've got one member here, Prue, who's got a part of a Rotary organization, any group of people that you think might be interested in hearing this presentation and learning more, that would be fabulous, that they can donate, and then anything. And then even if it's the price of a cup of coffee, and then they can listen to this video later, and hopefully maybe plan some fundraising themselves, would be quite amazing.
And also for
Yeah.
the Hong Kong people, like for Carol and everybody else, I've been in talks with Aarti Mirchandani. Everybody in Hong Kong here knows her.
Yep.
She owns Bookazine, which is our local bookstore chain. So we're looking to get Nadia's books in Bookazine. Fingers crossed that can happen soon. So Carol, I will let you know when that does happen, so you can buy it locally, buy them locally.
The other thing I wanted to mention is that if anyone's got links with any schools, high schools in particular, and particularly if they're doing something like the International Baccalaureate or any other thing like that, where there is a service component. I know that Nadia has very kindly said she's happy to speak to schools. And I think that if we can talk to teenagers, particularly, and particularly teenage boys, they need to understand what's going on with this misogyny, and how absolutely horrible and crushing it is for women, as well as teenage girls. And I know I do have one school up my sleeve already in Taiwan who is very much interested in doing something with Nadia. But if you know of any schools where, you know, it would be great for the kids to learn about this and to learn what it's like to live in a country like Afghanistan, and hopefully to raise awareness and to raise funds, that would be fantastic. But,
Should we ask everybody to, I'm going to turn it to gallery mode. I would love to, I think we should wrap up now, because I know Nadia has to send her kids to school very soon.
Oh, desperate for that coffee.
Yeah.
Coffee.
So Sarah, we can wrap up and then we can take a group photograph.
Sure. Okay. Well, look, I wanted to thank everybody. First of all, first and foremost, Nadia, thank you. As impressive as ever. And I think that the women of Afghanistan are very lucky to have you as one of their real protagonists. And your books are amazing. Please, everybody, try and read Nadia's books, just to get informed as well as shocked, but as well as moved greatly. And I think particularly if you read something like Sparks Like Stars, you will understand something of what Afghanistan was and could be. And it's something very, very special. I could feel it reading that book, and I would urge people to read as many of her books as possible. But also, look, thank you for everyone coming in, particularly our New Zealanders. I have to mention them, Jackie and Suzanne, for coming in at such a late hour. And yeah, again, thank you so much, all of you, for your support. And you'll be free to listen to this video again if you like. If you want to hear this all again, just contact Shikha and she can send you the link to the video. Okay, so now we need to see all your lovely faces for the photo. Oh, Shikha, I have to thank Shikha too, please. Sorry, Shikha. Shikha, who was our brilliant, Shikha, who did the hard work and took all the risks with that horrible Zoom system. Anyway, so
not hard work, and I will say it out there again and embarrass Nadia further, but her books literally, they made a profound difference in my life when I read them in 2019. So yeah, it is a testament to her writing, to your writing. Sorry, Nadia, you are very much here, that we are all here together. Can I get a really big smile from everyone? And I will take a photograph. Cheese. One more. Smile. Thank you.
can you
I
send that
can't
photo
thank
to
you
all of
all
us?
enough, because the energies you've put into, you know, organizing this, Sarah and Shikha, but and to all of you who have, you know, joined and spent your time here. Everyone's time is so valuable. So thank you. And I hope that these stories will reach you. I hope that you'll continue to stay engaged in the conversation. But just thank you so much for showing up.
Thanks to you, Nadia. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Thank you, Ritu.
Yes.
Good idea just to leave the meeting. Yeah, so just leave the meeting.
There's a button on your bottom right hand which says leave, which you can click on.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ritu.
Thank you, Leanne. Thank you, Sally.
Yeah, thanks, Leanne. Thanks, Sal, so much. So lovely to see your face. Mwah.